From high above the Pacific, the land almost disappears. A pale ribbon bends around blue water, sometimes narrow enough for a row of houses and a strip of trees to occupy much of what is visible. One side faces a lagoon, the other meets the open ocean. There are no mountains behind the homes, no broad valleys waiting beyond the next settlement, and very little room to move inland when the shoreline presses closer. Yet schools, churches, workshops, markets, docks, gardens, neighborhoods, and family histories all fit onto these strips of coral. This is the Marshall Islands. The country is made up of 29 atolls and 5 individual islands scattered across a vast area of ocean, with only about 70 square miles of land in total. The islands rise on average only around 2 meters above sea level. Those figures are dramatic from a map. At ground level, they become something more practical, where a house can stand how water is stored, what reaches a shop, how a boat is loaded, and how far a family may need to travel to reach another community. To understand how people live here, we begin in Majuro, where geography stops being a statistic and becomes part of the street. Drive along Majuro, and the atoll rarely lets you forget its shape. Homes, stores, offices, schools, churches, workshops, and roadside businesses stretch along a narrow corridor. In places, the lagoon and ocean are separated by only a short walk. The main road is more than a route through the capital. It is one of the lines around which much of daily life gathers. Cars and taxis pass people moving between homes, shops, schools, and offices. Small boats sit inside the lagoon, protected from the open Pacific by the reef and the long curve of the atoll. Corrugated roofs, concrete buildings, yards, utility poles, palms, signs, and parked vehicles create a scene that is neither a resort fantasy nor an untouched island village. Majuro is a working Pacific capital, living with very little spare ground. The 2021 census counted 418 people across the Marshall Islands, and almost 4 in 5 were living in urban areas. Much of that concentration is visible in Majuro and Ibaye. Here in the capital, jobs, schools, government trade, transport, and services draw people into a landscape that can expand mostly along its length. The result is a city with an unusual visual rhythm. One moment, the frame is full of traffic, walls, roofs, power lines, and storefronts. A few steps later, it opens directly to water. Boats appear behind buildings. Palms rise between homes. The lagoon can feel like a second street running beside the first. Space changes small decisions. Storage, drainage, parking, gardens, public buildings, shoreline protection, and housing all compete for narrow ground. Infrastructure cannot be pushed far away from neighborhoods because there is nowhere very far away to put it. A flooded road, a damaged shoreline, or a broken utility line can sit directly inside the same corridor people use for schoolwork, shopping, and home. A morning along this corridor shows how many different systems share the same strip of ground. A shop opens its metal shutters while traffic begins to thicken. A school entrance fills, then empties again. Someone carries groceries a short distance home. A pickup stops beside a yard. A boat on the lagoon side may be only a few dozen steps from the road traffic, moving in the opposite direction. There is no need for a dramatic event to make the geography visible. Ordinary movement does it. The island's narrowness also changes how distance is felt. A destination may be close across the width of the atoll, but much farther along its length. Much of Majuro's settled area follows the same basic line, so errands and commutes are funneled into a limited road network. A problem at one point can affect movement beyond the immediate neighborhood. Even quiet domestic details sit inside this compression. Laundry dries close to the road or shoreline. Water tanks stand beside houses. Small gardens use whatever ground is available. Boats, cars, construction materials, children at play, and household storage all occupy overlapping spaces. The capital is not simply crowded, it is layered. That compression is easy to see. Fresh water is less visible, but just as important. On a coral atoll, rainfall does not collect in large rivers or mountain reservoirs. The ground is porous, and the freshwater lens beneath it is limited. For many households, the roof and the tank beside the house are therefore part of the water system. Rain runs through gutters into storage. A tank that looks ordinary in wet weather matters much more when weeks turn dry. Different households use different combinations of rainwater, piped water, wells, communal supplies, or bottled water, depending on location and access. The system is not identical from one island to another, but rainwater collection has long been a major part of household water supply across the country. That gives a wet afternoon a different meaning. Water falling on a roof is not only weather. It is something being caught, stored, and rationed through the rhythms of a household. Gutters matter. Tank condition matters. The length of a dry spell matters. There is a striking contradiction in that. The Marshall Islands are surrounded by an almost unimaginable amount of water, yet fresh water can still become something families have to watch carefully. Ocean is everywhere. Drinking water is not. The way water is stored also shapes the house itself. A roof becomes a catchment surface. Gutters become part of the supply chain. Space beside a home may be reserved for tanks that would be less important in a place with large rivers or dependable groundwater. The infrastructure is domestic visible and easy to overlook until rain stops. This creates a different kind of planning from the one that happens at a port. A family does not control when the next rain will arrive, but it can control how much water is stored, how clean the catchment is, and how quickly the supply is used. During drought, those choices become sharper. Public systems and emergency measures can help, but the household tank remains a direct reminder that climate and daily routine meet at the roofline. Food carries the same tension between what is close and what must come from far away. Coconut breadfruit, pandanus, banana taro fish, and other local foods remain part of island life, especially where land and household production allow it. But the country also depends heavily on imports. In Majuro, the shelves of a store connect a narrow atoll to supply chains crossing thousands of kilometers. Rice flour, canned goods, frozen foods, drinks, fuel, building materials, machinery, and spare parts arrive because ships and aircraft keep the islands connected. Distance is built into what is available when it arrives and how much it costs to move. Local food, however, does not begin on a cargo ship. Along the lagoon, fishing remains one of the clearest ways the ocean enters everyday life. A small boat returns. Fish are carried ashore, cleaned, sold, shared, chilled, cooked, or moved into a larger commercial system. At one end of the scale are coastal and community fisheries. At the other is a commercial tuna fishery operating across Marshallese waters and linking the country to international markets. Those worlds are very different, but they begin with the same geography. The Marshall Islands has little land and an enormous maritime space. At a market or roadside stall, local fish can sit beside imported rice, packaged food, coconuts, breadfruit, prepared dishes, and woven goods. A meal may combine ingredients that traveled only a few kilometers with others that crossed an ocean before reaching the kitchen. That mix is more revealing than any single traditional dish. Food here is not a clean choice between old and new. It is a daily balance between local production, fishing, household income, transport schedules, weather, and the imported goods on which urban life increasingly depends. The ocean provides food. The port provides another kind of access. Together they shape what reaches the table. Follow the movement of one fish, and the different scales become easier to understand. It may come ashore from a small local boat and pass almost immediately into a household or a nearby sail. Another catch may enter a cold chain, a processing operation, or a commercial system tied to tuna vessels and export. The physical act is simple fish coming out of the water, but the economic paths after that can be completely different. The same is true on land. Breadfruit ripening near a home has almost no transport distance. A sack of rice may have crossed international shipping routes, a port, a warehouse, and a local store before it reaches the same meal. Those two foods can meet on one table without anyone treating the combination as unusual. For the viewer, that is the useful contrast, not local versus imported, but two supply systems working side by side, because neither one alone describes how urban households eat. They also shape work. In Majuro, government retail services, education, construction, transport, fisheries, and other urban activities support much of the formal economy. The port matters because so much ordinary life passes through it before appearing somewhere else. Containers arrive, fuel arrives, equipment arrives, fishing vessels enter the lagoon. Cargo moves from ship to dock, and from dock into stores, workshops, offices, and homes. The fishing economy shifts dramatically in scale. Community fisheries are managed around local use and coastal resources. Commercial tuna operations involve much larger vessels, access agreements, regulation, transshipment, and export. A quiet, small boat on the lagoon and an industrial fishing vessel may occupy the same body of water while serving completely different systems. Beyond the main urban centers, livelihoods can rely more heavily on fishing, subsistence, agriculture, handicrafts, local services, and copra. Coconut palms are not background decoration. Their fruit, leaves, fiberwood, and dried meat have practical value, and copra remains one way outer island production connects to cash income and national trade. But production only becomes useful beyond the household if there is a way to move it. That is when the ocean changes roles again. On a continent, one town may be connected to the next by road. Across much of the Marshall Islands, the road between communities is water. Majuro is the principal hub for domestic cargo and passengers. Ships and domestic flights connect the capital with outer islands. The service is nothing like travel along a highway. Schedules and reliability matter, and weather or mechanical problems can reshape a journey. At a dock, the scene is practical. Boxes are counted, bags are lifted. Fuel, food, school materials, equipment, mail, and personal cargo move toward a vessel. Passengers wait. Engines are checked. A departure may carry far more than travelers. It may carry part of the next stretch of ordinary life for another island. For outer island communities, maritime transport affects access to markets, education, health services, food, water, fuel, and emergency support. That changes the meaning of a delay. It can reach into a shop, a school, a household plan, or a medical journey. Once a boat leaves Majuro, the density of the capital falls away. The horizon grows larger. Services are less concentrated. Communities may be smaller, while access to family land, local fishing grounds, and household production becomes more immediate. Distance creates inconvenience, but it also creates a different relationship with the things a community can provide for itself. When a shipment arrives, the personal and practical can come off the same vessel. Food, tools, school supplies, fuel, household goods, parcels, and passengers. Loading and unloading become part of the connection between one island and the wider country. This is why isolated is only partly accurate. Outer islands are not disconnected worlds. They are connected unevenly. Goods move outward. Fish, copra, handicrafts, passengers, and news move back. Phones shorten some distances. Boats still have to cross the rest. The ocean is a road, but its surface changes every day. Imagine the sequence from the perspective of the dock rather than the map. A vessel approaches. Lines are handled. Cargo is brought forward. People identify what belongs to which destination. Heavy items move differently from food or personal bags. Some goods will travel again by truck or small boat after they are unloaded. The dock is a transfer point, but also a place where the country's huge distances briefly collapse into one practical scene. When service is limited, timing matters in a way that is difficult to see from Majuro. A household on an outer island may plan around an expected ship rather than around a same-day trip to a large store. A producer may hold Copra or handicrafts until transport is available. Someone needing a service concentrated in the capital may have to organize not only the appointment, but the journey, the weather, the fare, and somewhere to stay. Air travel changes some of those calculations, but it does not remove the dependence on ships. Aircraft move people faster. They cannot replace the volume of food, fuel, building materials, machinery, and other cargo that maritime transport carries. This is why a working dock can reveal more about island life than a postcard beach. It shows the country as a network, not isolated dots, but communities continually sending, receiving, waiting, and adapting to the limits of distance. The lagoon changes meaning with it. In Majuro, it can be a harbor, fishing ground, training space route, and broad open view behind dense settlement. Elsewhere, the same atoll geography may hold fewer buildings and services, but the reef, lagoon, wind, and weather remain just as present. Landscape cannot be separated from the rest of this story. The reef affects where boats can pass. The lagoon offers more protected water than the ocean side. Rain feeds tanks. Wind changes crossings. Waves shape shorelines. Coral ground limits what can be grown and where buildings can go. The pale rings visible from the air are not scenery surrounding daily life. They are the structure underneath it. That becomes especially clear when we look at digital access. The 2021 census shows that internet access is far from universal. Only about 43% of households reported having access, while mobile phones were much more widespread. A connection can mean contact with relatives, schoolwork information, business banking, or access to services. In Majuro, a phone can compress the Pacific into a screen. On a more distant island, limited connectivity can make the physical ocean feel large again. Modern tools have not erased older ones. They sit beside them, imported goods beside local food, outboard engines beside outrigger canoes, smartphones beside knowledge that was developed before GPS existed. That coexistence becomes especially visible at the canoe house on Majuro Lagoon. Wan Elon in Majul, often shortened to WAM, uses canoe and boat building as a way to teach young Marshallese practical skills while keeping maritime knowledge in active use. Inside the workshop, the canoe begins not as a symbol, but as a job. Wood has to be measured, shaped, fitted, joined, smoothed, and checked. Tools must be handled properly. The outrigger has to balance the hull. Line, sail, and structure must work when the canoe reaches real water. WAM combines this work with training in woodworking, basic English and mathematics life skills, sailing, and the names and parts of traditional canoes. The program links cultural knowledge to skills that can be used in employment and further training. The deeper knowledge begins once land disappears below the horizon. Marshallese navigation developed ways of reading stars, birds, wind waves, and swell patterns to understand direction and the presence of islands beyond sight. Wave behavior is especially important. Swells bend, reflect, and interact around atolls, creating patterns that an experienced navigator can learn to recognize. For a learner today, this knowledge exists in the same world as GPS radios, engines, and smartphones. Its value is not that modern technology must be rejected. Its value is that a way of understanding the ocean developed here over generations can still be practiced rather than remembered only in a museum. A canoe can now carry several meanings at once: transport, craftsmanship, training, recreation, competition, and cultural memory. That is not tradition frozen in time. It is tradition changing jobs. There is also a sensory difference between learning this knowledge from a diagram and learning it on water. A navigator does not see a painted line stretching toward the next island. The clues arrive through motion, the angle of a swell, The way a canoe rises and falls changes in wind. The behavior of birds' stars at night, and patterns created when waves interact with land that may still be beyond sight. That makes navigation difficult to reduce to a single spectacular fact. It is a trained way of paying attention. The skill depends on repeated experience, memory, language, and teaching. When it is passed on, what survives is not merely a route between two islands. It is a way of reading the environment. Weaving works in a similar way. Marshallese mats, baskets, fans, bags, and other handmade pieces turn plant materials into useful objects through skills that take time to learn. They can be used at home, given displayed or sold. Cultural events and markets bring some of that work into public space alongside food, music, dance, and canoe activities. The important part is not how old any of this looks. It is that people still do it. Marshallese remains the language of home and community for much of the country, while English is also widely used in education, government, and other formal settings. The two languages sit inside the same modern life rather than representing two separate worlds. The idea of manit is often used for Marshallese customs and cultural values. Family respect, land, community responsibilities, weaving, song, dance, church life, and seafaring traditions all appear within that larger cultural landscape, but their expression differs among families and islands. Land carries particular weight. Traditional Marshallese land rights are organized through matrilineal lineage. Children belong to their mother's lineage and have rights connected to land held by that group, although authority and use can involve several customary roles. On islands where every strip of ground is limited, land can be practical, economic, genealogical, and emotional at the same time. A place that looks tiny from above can therefore contain layers that an aerial image cannot show: who belongs there, who has responsibilities there, who planted trees there, and which relatives connect their history to the same ground. Households also tend to be large by many global standards. The 2021 census recorded an average of about 5.8 people per household. That does not make every family arrangement the same, but it helps explain why home is often experienced within wider networks of relatives rather than as an isolated private unit. Relationships have practical weight. Food can be shared. Children can move between relatives. A traveler may carry something for another household. News can arrive through family as easily as through a screen. Here, community is not simply a warm idea attached to island life. It is one of the ways distance is managed. The younger generation is growing up inside all of these systems at once. About 54% of the population counted in 2021 was under the age of 25. School phones, internet access, music, church activities, vocational training, family responsibilities, and the ocean are not separate eras of Marshallese life. For young people, they already overlap. Some opportunities are concentrated in Majuro and Ibe. Others require movement between islands or beyond the country. Under the Compact of Free Association, eligible Marshallese citizens can live, work, and study in the United States without a visa, and outmigration has become a major part of the country's demographic story. That creates choices that are personal as well as economic. Leaving can mean education, wages, healthcare, or joining relatives abroad. Staying can mean family, land, language, familiar social networks, and a direct place inside community life. Many families live with connections stretching across both. The tension is visible in places like Guam, where a young trainee can learn the form of a traditional canoe and modern woodworking skills in the same workshop. The goal is not to recreate an earlier century. It is to make old knowledge useful in the present. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Digital messages cross distances once measured only by voyages. Imported products sit beside locally made goods. Modern schooling exists alongside family knowledge. Fiberglass boats and engines move across waters once traveled under sail. Change does not arrive from one direction. It comes by ship, aircraft, classroom, workshop, and phone screen. And life is not only work, transport, and adaptation. People gather around homes, churches, markets, community events, and the lagoon. Canoe races, craft fairs, cultural celebrations, music, dance, food, and local performances create occasions when skills that may be private or practical become shared. The same water changes purpose with the hour. Fishing can be income or time with relatives. Sailing can be training, transport, competition, or pleasure. A lagoon can be a workplace in one moment and a place to swim, talk, or watch a race in another. In Majuro, the road also changes character as the day moves on. Deliveries slow. People head home. Children remain outside. Light falls quickly, and the lagoon behind the buildings takes on a different presence. Those ordinary pauses matter because the Marshall Islands are so often described through risk, low elevation, isolation, high transport costs, drought, flooding. All of those pressures are real. They do not occupy every minute. A community event can bring many of these threads into one place. Food is prepared. Woven work is displayed. Children move between relatives. Music and dance occupy a space that may have been used for something entirely practical the day before. A canoe race turns technical knowledge into a public event. What was learned in a workshop or from an older sailor becomes visible to people who may never build or navigate a canoe themselves. That public visibility matters for younger people. Culture is easier to carry forward when it is encountered not only as something elders explain, but as something that still creates activity, competition, skill, and social connection in the present. A conversation outside a home, a church gathering, a woven mat taking shape, a canoe crew preparing for a race, or a family meal may say more about why people value a place than another statistic about vulnerability ever could. Still, the geography never stops asking for attention. The islands stand on average only around 2 meters above sea level. Flooding, erosion, storm waves, high tides, heavy rain, drought, and saltwater intrusion already create risks for roads, homes, freshwater supplies, and public infrastructure. Sea level rise increases those risks. World Bank modeling for Majuro shows how sharply exposure can grow as water levels rise, and the country is investing in adaptation because there is little higher ground to retreat toward. On a mountainous island, move inland can sound like a simple instruction. On an atoll, inland may be only a few hundred meters away and no higher. So, adaptation becomes a series of difficult choices. Protect a shoreline, raise land or buildings, improve drainage, strengthen water systems, redesign public spaces, decide what can be defended, what can be changed, and where limited money should go first. The pressure is not only climate. Remoteness raises the cost of fuel, food, construction, materials, machinery, and spare parts. Outer island communities are especially exposed when sea freight is disrupted because essential supplies have few alternative routes. Drought can turn stored water into an urgent concern. A damaged dock can affect more than transport. A household in Majuro, a family on Ibaye, and a community on a distant atoll do not face the same daily problems. What they share is a narrow margin for error. The narrowness of the land also means that one adaptation can affect another. A seawall may protect a road or building, but change how water and sediment move nearby. Raising ground requires material and space. Improving drainage matters most where water has somewhere to go. Protecting a public facility may be urgent, while a family is thinking about a home, a tank, or a piece of customary land only a short distance away. There is no single engineering answer that can be copied across every atoll. The physical conditions differ, and so do the social consequences. That is why adaptation is not only a technical question about water height. It is also a question about which places people need to keep functioning, and which relationships to land cannot be measured only in square meters. And that brings us back to the question hidden inside the geography from the beginning. What makes these thin strips of coral worth calling home? There is no single answer. Home can be family land where names, responsibilities, and memories are attached to a specific piece of ground. It can be a breadfruit or coconut tree known for years. A church where relatives gather a route across the lagoon, learned in childhood, or the ease of hearing Marshallese spoken without explanation. It can be knowing which side of an atoll opens to the lagoon and which side meets the Pacific. Knowing who lives a few houses away. Knowing what should be carried when a boat leaves for another island. For someone living abroad, home can remain present through relatives, language visits, food remittances, and land. For someone who stays, belonging can exist beside frustration about prices, jobs, transport, water, or the future. Affection for a place does not require pretending that life there is easy. The ocean that creates distance also carries families and supplies between islands. The lagoon that limits building space supports fishing, travel, recreation, and memory. The narrow ground that looks fragile from above can be dense with relationships. Belonging here is not the opposite of uncertainty. It has been built inside it. From the air, the Marshall Islands can still look almost impossible. Threads of coral scattered across an ocean so large that the land seems barely there. Come closer and the scale changes. Roofs feed rain into tanks. Boats carry cargo toward outer islands. Fish move from water to market to kitchen. Coconut trees become food material and income. A road carries much of a capital because there are few other directions in which it can go. Young people learn through classrooms and phones, while older skills survive in wood sail, weaving language, and the movement of waves. None of those details removes the larger challenges. The country is low, remote, dependent on long supply lines, and increasingly exposed to a changing climate. But those facts only make sense once we see what is actually at stake. Not empty islands, homes. The question facing the Marshall Islands is not whether life here is unusual. Geography settled that long ago. The question is how people keep adapting without losing the relationships, knowledge, language, and sense of place that make these narrow atolls worth adapting for. Between lagoon and ocean, ordinary life has never had much room. Generation after generation, people have made room for it. If you want to keep exploring how people live beyond the familiar map, continue with another journey from Best Hidden Places.